It's awfully nice to see all of you. Nick Dirks, thank you for your leadership of this great university. Phil, thank you for organizing this summit. It's interesting that the timing of this summit comes when we are engaged here in a great national debate about who our next president is going to be. How many of you watched the debate last night, just out of a curiosity? I was curious in watching the debate that when the issue of the economy came up, neither of the candidates talked about what I consider to be, and I'm not alone, the biggest economic challenge we face in this country right now, and it's a challenge that many of you face in other countries as well, and that is widening inequality. Inequality of income and wealth. And also, along with inequality of income and wealth goes inequality of political power, because the three of them are coterminous. That widening inequality forces all of us, despite the lack of much mention in the presidential debate so far, to ask ourselves what our institutions of education are really all about, what the purpose is, what the public good is. In the United States, that has had, I believe, the best system of public education anywhere, at least traditionally, a new view of education has gradually seeped into our understanding. And that view is that higher education is no longer a public good, it is a private investment. Now, I cannot tell you exactly how that new view became as dominant as it has been, but I can tell you that it has been quite coterminous and quite convenient in terms of what has happened to state budgets. Since the Great Recession began in 2008, state funding, and as you know, in the United States, almost all of the funding for public higher education comes from the state governments rather than from the federal government. And since 2008, state funding of public higher education has been cut by 18%. Meanwhile, tuition at public universities has increased since 2008 by 33%. Now, it is true that if you are from a poor family, you usually get a lower tuition than if you're from a rich family. So even though the official sticker price of that public education tends to be 33% or much, much higher than it was, there are internal subsidies, cross subsidies for children of poor families. Notwithstanding, the middle class, the lower middle class, children of working class families, and indeed many poor families can no longer afford public higher education in the United States. And yet, ironically, we are in an era in which a four-year college degree has become more critical than ever before in terms of aspiring to join the middle class or even doing better than a middle class life, partly because globalization and technological change have put a premium on problem solving, problem identifying, pattern recognition, critical thinking, all of the kinds of intellectual activities that we believe higher education should provide. So that irony that higher education is becoming less affordable to many in the bottom 60%, children who whose parents are in the bottom 60%, just at a time when higher education is more necessary than ever before to succeed in the modern economy, and just as inequality is widening more than it has ever widened in the United States since what we call the Gilded Age of the 1880s and 1890s. Those three facts together, those ironies together, spell out, it seems to me, a national tragedy in the making. Public higher education in the United States still is called public higher education. 70% of American students are still enrolled in institutions that go by the name of public higher education, but public higher education is dying in the United States. If we stay on the path we are now on, there will be very little difference between public institutions and private institutions in terms of their funding or their cost structures or their tuition. The University of California, for example, to take one example just out of the blue, I believe is still, in fact, according to U.S. News, Times Higher Education, according to the U.S. News report, University of California at Berkeley is the preeminent #1 institution of public higher education in the United States. The University of California system is still in the lead in terms of state systems of higher education. The founders of the University of California had great foresight in terms of what they planned to do. I first visited the University of California, Berkeley, as a graduate student almost 50 years ago. I might add, as a parenthetical, it was the same year I had a date with Hillary Rodham, who is now running for President of the United States. The two are unrelated. But I, at that time, 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, was impressed with not only the beauty and the academic excellence and the extraordinary opportunity represented by the University of California, Berkeley, but also with the tuition, which at that time was near zero. Not quite zero, but near zero. What you must understand is that in the post-war era, the United States was on the way in many systems of public higher education toward making tuition free. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, now at Bernie Sanders' urging in the Democratic primaries, have put on the public agenda the possibility of tuition-free public higher education. Of course, nobody's talking about where the money's going to come from, but it is not a new idea. I want to emphasize with you, it is not a new idea. Meanwhile, our excellent private institutions, elite institutions and non-elite institutions of education in the United States are doing a great job, but they also are increasing their tuition faster than inflation. Why is that? Partly because everybody is competing against each other to attract the stars, star students and star faculty. And what do you have to do to attract the stars? Well, you've got to invest in the stars, not just in faculty salaries, but also in student amenities, fancy dormitories, and student centers, and athletic facilities, and recreation facilities, and all sorts of amenities that make some of these campuses look like and act like and function like country clubs. Well, the cost of these amenities is obviously going to be part of the cost structure of these universities. And as the costs increase, of course, the tuition increases. Right now, student loans in the United States, both with regard to public institutions and also private institutions, amount to $1.3 trillion. We have many, many young people who are 5, 10, 15, 20 years out of educational institutions who are still burdened by student loans. Our bankruptcy laws do not allow students to reorganize those student loans under bankruptcy. You get my drift. Our private institutions of higher education are not any longer doing the job they ought to do to fight or respond to widening inequality and the needs of children from the bottom 60% to get the quality of education they need to succeed in this new world. One of the additional ironies I have noted is that while states are withdrawing funding from public higher education, the federal government indirectly is providing a larger and larger subsidy to private elite higher education through the United States tax code, which provides a charitable deduction for any persons, usually quite wealthy, usually alumni of very elite private institutions, who wish to make a contribution to those elite private institutions. So, for example, if someone, say, Meg Whitman, a very wealthy individual, makes a contribution to, say, Princeton of $30 million, that's not really a $30 million contribution, it's a $20 million contribution, because $10 million is deducted as a charitable contribution, and that means the rest of the taxpayers make up the difference. In fact, a recent study showed that the state subsidy to the University of California, Berkeley, which U.S. News says is the #1 institution of public education, comes to about $7,000 now per pupil. The federal indirect subsidy through the charitable contribution to Princeton University, which U.S. News says is the #1 private institution in the United States, comes to $26,000 per pupil. Now, it would be one thing if our elite institutions were educating many children from the bottom 20 or 30 or 40% of the income distribution. That is not the case. There are some, no doubt, but the University of California, Berkeley has more Pell Grant eligible students, and that is one measure of how many students from poor and modest income families are here, Pell Grant eligible, has more Pell Grant eligible students here than the entire Ivy League of the United States put together. On top of that, we have what is called affirmative action for legacies. Have you heard that expression? I was very, very fortunate to go to a number of elite institutions. I did my undergraduate institution at Dartmouth College. I did graduate work at Yale. I also have a graduate degree from Oxford University. I am and feel very, very beholden to these institutions, but I have noticed over the last 30 or 40 years, more and more of the classes that are attracted and students who are attracted to these individuals are the children of alumni, and often wealthy alumni. In fact, there have been a number of studies showing that affirmative action is really not used so much for poor children or for minorities. Affirmative action, that is a special boost in admissions, is more often than not reserved for wealthy alumni, the children of wealthy alumni, on the theory that, and it's not irrational, that wealthy alumni will provide a lot of contributions to these institutions. Now, let me go back to my original point and wind up what I am saying, and hopefully I've inspired or instigated some questions from you. And not just about my date with Hillary Clinton. Higher education in the United States used to be considered a public good. We all understood it as a public good, no different from primary and secondary education. In fact, the natural, obvious connection as we expanded upward toward children who were 12 years old and 14 years old and 16 years old in terms of secondary education, and then toward young people who were 20 years old and 22 years old, the obvious, it seemed to us in the 1950s and 60s, the obvious direction we wanted to go in terms of free, universal, public education was toward free, universal, public higher education. But beginning in the 1970s, and more relentlessly in the 1980s, and then culminating with the Great Recession, a very different ideology became dominant, seeing public higher education as qualitatively different from primary and secondary education, and seeing it less of a public good than a private investment. While it is true that the returns to a family or to a child of a first-rate private or public university education are very, very substantial, and the university premium is growing. It is now about 60% over those in terms of lifetime earnings who are not getting a university education. Nonetheless, there can be no doubt that the public gains enormously from a well-educated citizenry. And I don't mean only in terms of science and math and national competitiveness. In fact, these days it's very hard to understand what national competitiveness means. What I am talking about is a democracy that is enriched through having universal public higher education. A democracy that needs people capable of critical thinking. A democracy that needs public deliberation over central issues to that democracy. A democracy in a society that needs to foster the quality of critical thinking that we have and try to foster in our university education systems. The loss of that vision, the loss of that ideal, it seems to me, is a profound problem and a profound challenge to the United States in the future, and also to all of you who view the United States and United States higher education as a model for where you and your countries and your higher education systems wish to go. Because we are leading the world right now in inequality in terms of advanced economies. And we are leading the world right now in terms of inequality of access to higher education. It is vitally important that we reverse these directions, both of them, and they are intimately connected. Thank you very much.
So I think we have a few moments for some questions, if anyone would like to start. I do have many of my own, but I'd like to open it up as quickly as possible because time's limited. I think we have some mics in the room. Okay, I'll start. We have a question at the back here. Can we get a mic over? If you could just say your name, please.
Yes,
well.
Mitchell Stevens, Stanford. Thank you for your remarks. To what extent do you imagine that we might have had the democratic expansion of public higher education in the United States were it not for the Cold War and the spectacular geopolitical ambitions of the United States federal government that was executed in so many ways through institutions like yours and mine? And can you think of a counterfactual in which we would similarly invest in that kind of public sector expansion independently of a major global conflict?
Actually, it's interesting. The Cold War was used as the major justification in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s for the quality and quantity of public investments in this country that we needed to do quite independent of the Cold War. And I'm talking about not only the investments we made after Sputnik in 1958 in education at all levels, including higher education, but also the biggest infrastructure program we've ever launched in this country, the highway building program, which we called the National Defense Highway Act, just as we called our expansion of education in the wake of Sputnik the National Defense Education Act. In fact, everything we did in those years that was on a very large scale, that really was the public investment that we needed to do quite independently of the Cold War, we used the term national defense in the actual authorizing legislation. So I think that the fall of the Soviet Union presented us with something of a conceptual, ideological, intellectual conflict because we didn't any longer have that enemy, quote unquote, to justify our major public investments with regard to that kind of justification. If you're talking about affordability, I don't think there's any question that public investments in education, generally speaking, generate huge returns, much larger returns than most other investments that government makes, or for any other relative to any other spending the government does. And if you agree with the notion of dynamic scoring, which is now all the fashion, then the dynamic scoring with regard to every dollar spent on education from early childhood all the way through higher education would justify much, much greater expenditures than we are now making.
Thank you. Any more? Can we get the mic over to the middle here?
Yeah, hello, Shirley Compton from the University of Bradford in England. Phil mentioned at the beginning about talent, the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Oxford had said talent was the key thing about higher education. Yet we hear that talent costs. So costs of the campus, costs of the staff, costs of the research and the investment. And I'm just wondering what your views are on the actual costs and the nature of competition in relation to that.
Well, I think it's clear that talent does cost, but I think we also have to ask the ancillary question, which is how much of the cost is a zero-sum contest with other institutions, where we're simply bidding up the price of talent. I mean, the market is a human creation, whether we're talking about a labor market for professors or for university leaders or for CEOs. And I think it's important to recognize that fact. In the United States, we tend to award our teachers at primary and secondary levels very little money relative to, say, upper-level executives or even middle-level executives in the private sector. And it is important to understand that the law of supply and demand is not repealed at the schoolhouse door. If you want talented men and women to go into primary and secondary teaching, obviously you've got to sufficiently reward them. At the university level, I think a similar analysis can be made relative to what talented people are able to do in society elsewhere. But I guess I want to stress that there is something of a tautology in that argument.
We have one at the back. It may have to be the last one, actually, if you can be very quick.
Yeah, Mike Durda here at the UC Berkeley. My question is, to the extent to which university costs are driven up by more and more amenities for students, is there any way that you can see that we sort of quell that kind of arms race and encourage people to move more accepting of college as maybe more austere or having less lavish perks or things like that?
Well, there may be some ways to reduce that arms race. I think that there might be a possibility of an antitrust exemption, an exemption to the antitrust laws for universities that want to sort of moderate that arms race. Maybe some of the measures that are used, such as U.S. News, could emphasize different qualities and give more weight to, for example, economic diversity rather than the quality of the amenities. I don't think, though, there is much. There's two. Let's make this very clear. Some of those amenities really do improve the quality of life, and I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush. When I was at university, like a lot of old fogies tend to want to do in their reminiscences, they say, I look back and it was a pretty Spartan existence, even at the elite institutions that I attended. And I could not believe it when I dropped my sons off at their respective universities, at the plush qualities of their existence. But I'm suspicious of my old foginess about that. On the other hand, when I do look at the qualities of campus centers and recreational facilities and health facilities and all of the other creature comforts, it seems to me we're going way beyond what is simply or could be argued is necessary and appropriate. It's in that realm where those costs really are, I don't think, justifiable. Neil, are we just about finished?
I was just hoping to squeeze one tiny one in if we've got a moment. Yep. Just a final word, actually. I've had lots of conversations. I think this has wide resonance to many other parts of the world. And one of the common issues that comes up, I think, in the UK, in Australia, and here in America is this idea that it's become a sense that education is a private good. How do we restate the case for education as a public good? We can do it in economic terms quite easily, but it's the idea there's no votes in it. There's no votes in investing in higher education. How do we change the dial and get people to appreciate the huge, huge value that universities provide to human well-being?
Well, I think the first step is for university leaders and educators to change the frame of the debate, to change the dialogue, to change the discussion. I even am uncomfortable with the term public investment rather than a public good, because a public investment sounds like there's a return on that investment and that you've got to somehow measure that return. Undoubtedly, there is a return, a public return on the investment in education, as we've talked about and I even talked about just a moment ago. But I think the notion of a public good, that public higher education really does improve the quality of life for the citizens of a nation and should improve the quality of life for more and more of those citizens, it seems to me, a very important dimension. It's just in the reframing that is important. Government officials also need to reframe that debate. It's just too easy to fall into the investment, and particularly private investment framework. Secondly, it seems to me important here in the United States, and to those of you who are in analogous situations, to look at other areas of public budgeting. For example, in the United States, we spend a fortune on prisons. On a per prisoner basis, we are spending more on many of our federal and state prisons than we are on higher education. There is no justification for that. And that really undermines the capacity of state budgets to do what they need to do. Also, there's no justification for locking that many people up to begin with.
Okay, well, I think, sadly, because this could go on for a lot longer, we're out of time. So if we could all just thank.
Well, thank you, and good luck to you. Thank you.